Today, we're going to continue on addressing the matter of how to vote our biblical values. The Bible should influence everything about our lives as Christians. It's the all-encompassing guide for faith and conduct. And I pray to God that you're going to see how faithful is the Word of God, even in our day-to-day lives and how we address contemporaneous issues. And even things like who we might vote for. And we're going to take the Word of God today and we're going to apply it right to current events. And I hope you're going to see how powerfully it speaks to those events and how much we can trust our Bibles to lead us in the right direction. This whole idea of how to vote our biblical values is not an easy issue to come to grips with, especially when we consider Bible passages like we see in 2 Corinthians 6. Don't team up with those who are unbelievers. How can righteousness be a partner with wickedness? How can light live with darkness? What harmony can there be between Christ and the devil? How can a believer be a partner with an unbeliever? When it comes to living out our Christian faith in the world, we are being warned that we can't be partners with wickedness. There's no compromise with evil. There is an inevitable clash between those who are in the kingdom of light and those who are in the kingdom of darkness. An inevitable clash. And I know that in these days, people are always talking about, we need to find compromise. We need to learn how to get together better. The Bible does not necessarily say that's so. It's kind of bringing out the other side of it. This was brought home this week when I put a post on Facebook based on last week's message. Did any of you see that post? I just would urge you to go ahead and take a look at it. On our church page, there were 88 responses, 79 comments, 13 shares. On my personal page, there were 21 responses, 4 comments, 4 shares. Altogether, that's over 100 responses. That's a lot of people weighing in on the matter. 83 comments, 17 shares. When you start getting that level of response, you know you hit on a hot topic. But if you were to go to that post on the church page, you might find yourself shocked at the number of oppositional posts filled with hateful comments, disparaging both Christians and the Bible. Maybe that's why some of us aren't more active for the cause of Christ on social media. Now, the vast majority of people, I would say, responded in a very positive way. You know, they hit the like button, they hit the heart button. They were in favor of what we had to say. But then when you consider all those oppositional and nasty posts, should we become discouraged by that? Well, certainly it's sad that people find themselves these days in that spiritual state. Now, you might find it helpful to read some of my responses to them in an effort to get them to think about their position or to take stock of their true spiritual state. And I would invite you to read those posts and chime in on your own. Think about it, pray about it. I kind of have a litmus test on those I respond to and those I don't. I mean, there are some who are so oppositional and ugly and nasty that it's like, it doesn't really pay to respond. They're in a place that defies reason. All we can do is pray for them. What are we seeing here, or what we are seeing here, is an example of two classes clashing. two classes clashing. And this is really at the heart of much of the present-day political debate going on in this country. We think that the main contest is between the two major parties of our day, the Republicans and the Democrats. I would say that's not so. There's an aspect that needs to be considered that goes much deeper than that. This dynamic has been going on all the way back to the time of Christ. And we read about Jesus dealing with this in Luke chapter 5. Later, Levi held a banquet in his home with Jesus as the guest of honor. Many of Levi's fellow tax collectors and other guests also ate with him. But the Pharisees and their teachers of religious law complained bitterly to Jesus' disciples. "Why do you eat and drink with such scum?" Didn't have a very high attitude of the normal people inhabiting the land of Israel in that day. Why do you eat and drink with such scum? Why do you have anything to do with those deplorables? Why would you want to have anything to do with those people who are clinging to their guns and Bibles? They're scum. So, I see here that I missed a portion, so I'll just read it to you. Jesus answered them, "Healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. I have come to call not on those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners and need to repent." So Jesus here is being taken to task by the ruling class of the Pharisees. And they are getting after him, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with such scum?" Well, Jesus saw these people as the normal people of the day, the country class, we could call them. Those who needed a helping hand to get their lives on track. But here's the key. These normal people of the day, this country class, these sinners, were more open to the real work of God in their lives than were the ruling class of the Pharisees. And Jesus could see it. So he was speaking and challenging the ruling class, saying, "You guys don't really get what's going on here. You could learn something from these normal, everyday people." And I think it's pretty evident that there are two distinct camps in America, and they flow even from biblical times, like we just read of this instance of our Lord. And when we understand more fully the nature of these two camps, we're going to understand more of what's actually happening in America, across the political landscape that we're facing even in current events. And I would say that this election is more about classes than about parties. In America today, we have a ruling class. You had the ruling class of the Pharisees. You had the ruling class of the Roman government in the times of Christ. So too, we have a ruling class. This is a book I've been reading quite ravenously for a few days by Angelo M. Codavilla. He has passed away. The book was written in 2010. And he makes the assertion in this book that there is a ruling class in America today. His premise is that a ruling class, you may have heard them referred to as the elite class, the deep state, the administrative state, and he maintains that it's made up mostly of Democrats. And that the ruling class always wants to arise to the point where they get to call the shots. Well, in the United States of America, if you really think about it and read the Constitution, there's no provision for a ruling class. There's a provision for a servant government elected by the citizens to serve the interests of the citizens. But Codevilla is saying here that the ruling class that has been developing since the 1930s in America really has no interest in what the citizens want. What they have an interest in is their own agenda, and mostly to shore up their own base of political power. America started out with only one class, the country class, we could call it. That's what Codevilla calls it. And they really love the land. They love the freedom they enjoyed under the new concept of America that was designed to protect and to preserve the God-given personal liberties of every single citizen. Not to trample over them, but to preserve them. They love their freedom to be self-sufficient and self-governing. They love their freedom of speech, to whine and complain and grumble about the government to whatever extent they felt it was reasonable, with no repercussions. You see, that had never been available to people in a country before. What was the American Revolution really about? It was about the country class breaking from England, who was the ruling class. And the country class got fed up with the ruling class. And they believed that they did not exist only to enhance the good lives of the ruling class, to work hard and pay more and more taxes, so that the ruling class could live a privileged life. When it comes to the government, the country class, for the most part, would just like to be left alone and to live their lives. I don't know about you, but I think about that often. Just leave me alone. Just let me live my life as I see fit. I can understand the necessity of certain basic laws because the role of the government is to punish the wicked and promote the righteous. But just stay out of my hair and let me do things the way I see fit. And I think that's largely accurate when it comes to the spirit of America. But now I want to share a video that reveals that this seems to be more and more difficult, and it's because of the ruling class. Just watch it and see what you think.
The administrative state is openly hostile to the Constitution. It allows for myriad methods of policymaking. In reality, at the end of the day, it represents a return to pre-constitutional government. The administrative state today is, rather than the aristocracy that the progressives hoped it would be, simply an oligarchy. It's the rule of the few for their own sakes, a distinct and insular class of people, rather than a trained elite, corrupt and distant from the people whom they rule. They're supported by a coterie of clientele groups who depend upon the modern administrative state for privileges and benefits. The average person in this system is systematically and fundamentally disenfranchised. Policy is not made for his benefit, and he is largely unable to control the machinery of the state. In sum, the administrative state is the antithesis of constitutional government and cannot even live up to the expectations of its progressive founders. The administrative state intrudes upon even the minutest aspects of people's lives. The federal government dictates the amount of water that you can have in your washing machine and in your dishwasher. The federal government dictates the content of the light bulbs that light up your house in the evening. They dictate the composition of the spouts on the gas can that you use to fill your lawnmower. they've determined that the ordinary gas can spout allows for too many fumes to escape. And so instead, they created a system which is all but impossible for the ordinary person to use and probably causes more spills anyway. The federal government dictates to the manufacturers of step ladders the angle at which the ladder must be placed when they test it for the sake of determining its weight rating. Meanwhile, we might note, the administrative state seems to be sincerely uninterested in performing the tasks that our founding fathers expected legitimate government to perform. Major cities have chronic amounts of unsolved murders, which they never seem to bother to get to in many cases. The city of Detroit discovered several years ago a backlog of thousands of unprocessed rape kits that took more than a decade to finish. The mayor of Portland, Oregon seems perfectly content to allow Antifa to take over the streets of the city and to enforce the laws themselves. And Portland is one of a number of examples of progressive cities on the West Coast which also seem perfectly content to allow their cities to become mountains of drugs and human excrement. At the national level, our government, or at least much of our government, seems to be deeply unconcerned for maintaining our territorial integrity in the face of thousands, if not millions, of illegal immigrants coming into the country, and thus unconcerned with protecting the basic sovereignty of the United States. So that's another way that we can think about the anti-constitutionalism of the administrative state. That is to say, it inverts its priorities. It becomes intensely focused on things that legitimate government ought not to do, and it neglects the things that just government should do.
So, what he's asserting in the video is that there is an administrative state, there is a ruling class, and the prime motivation of the ruling class is to establish themselves as those who make the rules. And I don't know if you recognize, there was a picture there of President Woodrow Wilson, who many see as the first of the progressives. And Wilson had no heart for the Constitution. He just saw it as a document that was standing in the way of him forming what he viewed as a utopia for the American citizens, and that the ruling class knew better for the country class what was in their best interests. And they're also very tied into a globalist worldview, an imperialist view, that we've got to expand the ruling class of America across the world. And they see themselves as more capable, more educated, more privileged, and more deserving of power than the members of the country class. Now I want to just read a couple of excerpts from this book on the ruling class as he explains how this fleshes itself out in American government. Ever since the 1930s, as people who think this way have taken over more and more functions in an ever bigger government, they have become ever more inclined to dismiss the public's opposition as ignorant and to believe themselves entitled to shape a new and different America. Through their conception of their own superiority and by accumulating power, they have made themselves into a bipartisan ruling class. Now he's saying both Democrats and Republicans are in league in establishing themselves as the ruling class that now dominates public affairs and encroaches ever more into our lives' most intimate details. This is why millions of Americans are now reasserting our right to obey the Constitution. to which officials wear allegiance upon taking office rather than to obey any official. The most obvious evidence of the American people's desire to be responsible for our own lives and to govern ourselves is the taxed enough already party movement, the Tea Party movement. Now we just need to remind ourselves that he wrote this in 2010, and he didn't live very long beyond writing this book. But he's kind of foretelling what we're experiencing in our own day. He says, but that desire transcends all organizations, joining independents, Republicans, and not a few Democrats into what we might call the country party. So we're saying that this election is more about classes than about parties. The ruling class consists of the ins, and the country class consists of the outs. And most of the ins are Democrats, most of the outs are Republicans, although there is crossover. But here's the thought-provoking thing. The ins make up about 1/3 of the population who aim to have their version of the American dream subsidized by the outs, which is 2/3 of the population. And the outs have felt for a long time that the ruling class has been demeaning them, ignoring them, paying only lip service to the concerns they express about an ever-increasing national debt, about the lack of safety when it comes to an open borders policy, concerns about a globalist view of government, and an ever-expanding seeking of influence in other countries to the expense of meeting the needs of our own citizens. And then the pushing of the woke ideology upon all Americans, and anyone who doesn't toe the line is attacked and told they're being unscientific and unpatriotic. And it's not just that the country class feels demeaned by the Democrats who mostly make up the ruling class. Only about 1/4 of Republicans feel represented by their Republican leaders. And they're often mystified when they do hold sway through the voting process and get a Republican in there, that the Republican seems to have paid only lip service to the concerns that were expressed to them over and over again during the campaign process, but now they seem to be cozying up right away to the ruling class. The Republican leaders have talked a good game, but their votes have betrayed their real aspirations for becoming part of the in crowd. And that's why they sometimes end up being attacked by those in the country class who feel so betrayed by the way they have not followed through on the promises they made during the campaign. But these Republicans, not all of them, but some of them, they want their piece of the pie for being part of the ruling class. And they cannot get it without being part of the in crowd, part of the ruling class. I have a classmate who spent a lot of time during her working years in Madison, working the Capitol. And she was with some lung association, I don't remember what it was. And we debated very hotly some of the political issues, just texting back and forth furiously on Facebook. But she maintained that she saw so many good people ruined who had stated the most idealistic of intentions before they were elected, and yet were just taken right in by the ruling class, betraying their constituency in very short order. See, the temptations are so great. Now, Angelo made this prediction writing in 2010, and I just want to read it to you and ask you to think about it if this is something we are seeing in our own day. All right, this is 14 years later. Did he have his finger on the pulse of the developments in America? Most of these country class voters, along with independents and a few Democrats, make up the vast country party. Sooner rather than later, for better or worse, this supermajority of Americans will get its own political vehicle. Sooner or later, this supermajority, I think that's what accounts for a lot of the frustration of the country class. Hey, almost everybody I know thinks the way I do. Why are we always getting the short end of the stick? Nobody's listening to us. And he's saying that this frustration is going to build. Sooner rather than later, for better or worse, this supermajority of Americans will get its own political vehicle, either an obviously reformed Republican Party or a new one. The Tea Party movement is part of the soil in which it must root. Enter Donald Trump. I mean, he just came in at the right time. And he started expressing the concerns of not the country class or the ruling class, but of the country class. And asking, what the heck is going on in this country? We're not following the Constitution at all. And this vast swath of voters in the country class started listening and saying, you know what? He's speaking my engie here. He's communicating my concerns. Now, there has been just a massive push against the many faults and flaws that the ruling class sees in Donald Trump. They're doing everything they can to discredit him. Now, I've shared this before because I've had a lot of people take me to task. You call yourself a Christian, you call yourself a pastor, and you would vote for someone like Trump with his past history. And I really view that as an attack to shut down the country class from expressing their support. But here's the way I look at it, and I tell them so. If Jesus Christ were running, I would vote for him. But he is not voting. So I need to do the best I can as a citizen, and I need to align myself with the candidate I feel will best express biblical values. That does not mean that that person is perfect. I mean, we can look at either one of the candidates and go into their personal histories and find a lot of faults and flaws. But those are the two we have before us, and all we can do is apply our biblical values to the candidates and do the best we can to be faithful as Christians. Now, I'm not telling you need to vote for who I'm voting for, but I think I'm delivering a fairly good process for thinking through some of these issues and how we can vote our biblical values, which is our true responsibility as Christians. So, let's go ahead and continue in some of the things he foretells here. Today's ruling class was exposed to a narrow, uniform set of ideas and adopted a set of habits and tastes, as well as a secular canon of sacred myths, saints, sins, and ritual language. Now, of course, he didn't know this was coming down the pike, but he is perfectly describing the woke movement, which is the false religion of the ruling class. And they set the rules. If you're white, you've exercised white privilege. You deserve to be punished for your past sins. and being related in some way to a slave owner in your past. Now, I don't know about you, but I would think it's true of most of us. I don't know of any of my ancestors who came to this country while slavery was still in force, but they pronounced me guilty because of the color of my skin. So they want to set these rules. And the ruling class's chief pretension is its intellectual superiority. Its members claim to know things that the common herd cannot. It confuses its own opinions with science. Now, as we go along, we need to be open to the leading of the Holy Spirit. I've had an issue for a long time with this whole global warming pretension. And so that has prompted me to read. What prompted me to read? Uneasiness in my spirit. Listening to people say, you need to follow the science, you're a climate denier. And inside, the Holy Spirit is prompting me, no. Do you know that there are many rational scientists who have done studies that stand in contradiction to what we're being told as a science when it comes to climate change? Maybe in one of the next messages, I'll share some of that actual science with you. But you see, we're not supposed to think. We're just supposed to fall in lockstep with whatever the ruling class says. And if we dare think and oppose, well, then we're being MAGA radical, or we're being compared to fascists, or we're unpatriotic, or we're a threat to democracy. I thought democracy was about freedom of speech and the right to dissent, the right to have a different way of thinking about things, the right to debate in the marketplace, and to have your ideas heard, and to see whose ideas stand the test, instead of just saying, shut up and fall in line, which is what our ruling class is all about these days. I mean, when you think about Trump coming, could there have been a more perfect storm? I mean, he just gets right in their face and confronts them. Now, he's not always the most courteous vessel about it, the most tactful. He definitely could be considered a blunt instrument. There are times we all say, did you really have to say that? But on the other hand, I think he has to get the award for the thickest skin in all of human history. I mean, don't you have to kind of be that way to handle what he's handling? He says today's ruling class was exposed to a narrow, uniform set of ideas and adopted a set of habits and tastes, as well as a secular canon of sacred myths, saints, sins, and ritual language. The class's chief pretension is its intellectual superiority. Its members claim to know things that the common herd cannot. It confuses its own opinions with science. We've seen this in notable instances. I wrote this in there myself when it came to the COVID response. You're not following the science. You're not getting vaccinated. And way back when, once again, Diana and I prayed through that, and we felt the Holy Spirit saying to us, don't take that. And we freely shared that on a personal level. And we said, you need to hear from God for yourself. Some people got upset and said, well, how come you're not telling people don't take that vaccine? Well, because then I would be just like the government. You know, we have influence in sharing the truth as best we know it, but every single person is free and responsible for making up their own mind. Same thing with the information I'm sharing with you today. You know, obviously you can tell where I'm leaning personally, but that's not speaking for our church. It's not speaking for our church at all. Every person here, it has the privilege as an American citizen and a follower of Jesus Christ to follow their own conscience and sort through the issues as they see fit. But I think we're going a long way today to explaining our present day situation. So the class's chief pretension is its intellectual superiority. Its members claim to know things that the common herd cannot. It confuses its own opinions with science. I remember when I posited a few thought-provoking ideas on climate change, there was a guy coming to the church here, and he just attacked me for being an uneducated rube. Have you even gone to college? Have you ever taken a science class? Actually, I think I had more in the way of degrees than he actually had. But that wasn't the point. I wasn't trying to exercise any superiority over him. I was just trying to engage him in debate. Let's think about these things a little bit. Maybe we're not getting the full scoop. What other kind of areas is this holding sway? While most Americans pray to the God who created us in His own image, our ruling class prays to themselves as saviors of the planet and as shapers of mankind in their own image. While the ruling class thinks that Americans are unfit to run their own lives, most Americans have noticed that our ruling class has lost every war it has fought. They have run up an unpayable national debt and generally made life worse. So, one thing that has to be noted in order for us to understand how the ruling class works is that they have globalist aspirations. Now, I don't know exactly how that slide found its way in there, but I don't know how many of you were around when the first George Bush was president. But you remember how he was always talking about a new world order? He just loved that phrase. He couldn't say it enough. He was tipping us off as to his globalist aspirations. It even came out that at one time, when he was vice president, he was talking to some other diplomats from other countries, and he said, you have to understand that President Reagan is a conservative of the extreme view. And most Americans don't see that as a credible position. It's mostly for the rubes and unintellectual people. So there he was undercutting President Reagan, who definitely was of the country class, not of the ruling class. So George Bush, the first, had a view of an imperialistic America, exporting our democracy to other countries and being part of the global community. And over the years, I've really struggled with George W. because I found him so likable and he's a Christian. But the more and more I review his policies and stance, I think he really got us off the beaten path into imperialism as well. We need to open those China markets. We need to have access to those markets. There was not a shred of protectionism in his ideology when it came to American citizens and their jobs at American companies and their long-standing position a potential success, because it's not a fair fight. When you have Chinese companies relying on slave labor, paying $1 or $2 an hour, working their people to the point of bitter exhaustion and even suicidal escape. And then we say to the American companies, well, you've got to do better than them, but pay your people a livable wage. See, people have been scratching their heads about some of these things, about where our leaders really stand. And I think this is the first point at which some of that started happening for Republicans and especially Christians. Was America from its founding bent on an obligation toward imperialism, toward ever-increasing expansionism, toward making other countries little Americas, no matter the cost in blood and treasure? Maybe this is something the Founding Fathers weren't so interested in. Here's a guy named Jack Posobiec, and he's addressing this issue.
I do think that the broader moral brushstrokes could be painted a little bit more of this understanding of, we remember President Trump when he spoke in 2016 down there at his speech at the Mayflower, saying we will no longer surrender this country and its people to the false song of globalism. And the nation state remains the best entity for the safety and security of the people. We must remember that we are nation states first. We are not global empires. In fact, if you go back to 1776, there's a view that you can take of it where the United States being founded as a nation state was the Founding Fathers pulling the colonies, right at the time, the 13 colonies, out of the global system at the time, which was the British Empire. And you can go read Adam Smith, you can go read all of this, and Wealth of Nations is essentially an economics trade balance sheet for the British Empire. Comes out in the same year, 1776, and he's walking you through the global economy. And at one point he mentions that there's some troubles in the colonies right now, but I'm not sure if anything will come of it. He actually says that in the book. And so he's talking about how the global economy worked under the British Empire and what the Founding Fathers understood. And yes, of course, they're the Constitution and Federalist Papers, et cetera, but go back. These guys were the economists. These guys were top members of business. They were top elites. The Founding Fathers understood that if we wanted a piece of the pie for ourselves, if we wanted to control our own pie, control our own destiny, then being a subsidiary colony of the globalist overlords of London would never allow that to take place. We needed to have our own ownership of our own land and our own people. That's what the founding of the United States was for. The Constitution is the blueprint for a nation state, not for an international government. And of course, you go around Washington, D.C., and I know you're there now, Dave, and I go around all the time, and these guys don't understand that. They want us to be the global government. Go down to Georgetown, go down to Foggy Bottom. That's exactly how they think about it. Right. They don't care about the people in Appalachia. They care about the people that are, on the other side of the Khyber Pass, and they care about, and they're very concerned about the Donbass and the Tsar's forces marching through and which side of the Dnieper River. And it was both sides of the aisle, by the way. And Trump was the disruptor who came in and upset this apple cart.
So here's another difference between the ruling class and the country class. The ruling class has these globalist aspirations. The ruling class is imperialistic. The country class is about minding our own business and getting our own house in order. So the country class is more focused on our own country. Now, I want to just make a couple of comments for your consideration, and I am not diminishing those who have served in wars or your decision to do so. And I think that's marked down as one of the highest ways a person could serve their fellow man. But you think about the Vietnam War that went on for 20 years. The Afghan War that surpassed the Vietnam War by 6 months. What did we gain? That could be a whole debate in itself. But we come down to asking ourselves, were these wars worth the expenditure of blood and treasure that America incurred? These are just a couple of examples of how the attitudes of the ruling class and the country class have been diverging for quite some time. Now, in current events, you may have heard Kamala Harris already talking about making a greater investment in Ukraine. As part of the ruling class, she has a globalist mindset. Trump is saying, we'll be out of there right quick, and has told Zelensky as much. He thinks we should spend that money on American citizens and on interests that will more directly help America. So the clash of the ruling class globalists and the country class patriots is brought home in how our national treasure was allocated this very week in the wake of these hurricanes. Watch this discussion.
But look, Congressman, you are an elected official. How is it possible that Kamala Harris can just spend money like a drunken sailor? I mean, she is facing criticism this morning from angry Americans because she pledged $157 million to Lebanon at the same time that residents of North Carolina are struggling to recover from Hurricane Helene, and another hurricane is on the way. Here's what Kamala Harris posted on X. I am concerned about the well-being of civilians suffering in Lebanon. The United States will provide $157 million in additional assistance to the people of Lebanon for essential needs such as food, shelter, water, protection, and sanitation. Meanwhile, FEMA is running out of money, according to Alejandro Mayorkas. And reportedly, they've abandoned a devastated North Carolina town because they allegedly were not allowed to drive around a sign that said road closed. One resident said that nobody's been bringing in supplies except civilians. Tulsi Gabbard has been on the ground. She spoke to me yesterday. She's been on the ground in North Carolina as well as Georgia. Watch this.
The sad thing is, Maria, you know, I look back to what happened in Maui during the wake of the tragic historic fires there and the many layers of failures that came from FEMA. And I'm seeing the exact same thing play out here today. While Vice President Harris and Joe Biden claim to be doing all they can and providing all the resources possible, FEMA is out on the ground, they say. But when you go out into these rural communities, they have yet to see anyone with a FEMA jacket on knocking on their door saying, how can we help you?
So, Congressman, what's the story here? I mean, FEMA is out of money. I mean, House Republicans, yourself included, want answers from DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas because apparently FEMA has redirected billions of dollars in aid from the emergency fund to illegal migrants. Now, FEMA and the White House is denying this, but White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre back in 2022 laid it all out. Watch this.
FEMA regional administrators have been meeting with city officials on site to coordinate available federal support from FEMA and other federal agencies. Funding is also available through FEMA's emergency food and shelter program to eligible local governments and non-for-profit organizations upon request to support humanitarian relief for migrants. We'll continue to do what we can as a federal government to support these cities as we rebuild our asylum processing system after it was gutted by the Trump administration.
I mean, Congressman, give me a break. Okay, they can't say they did not redirect the FEMA emergency money to illegals. She just told us what they were doing. But my question is on you. You're an elected official. How are they getting away with this? Aren't there three branches of government here?
Maria, there's a lot to unpack. It doesn't make you moral to try and help your neighbor when your own house is on fire. So I was one of those furious people when I read her tweet about helping, sending hundreds of millions of dollars to Lebanon. I honestly, first of all, they think money fell from the sky. I thought when I read it, she must have been talking about some town, Lebanon in Georgia or in North Carolina. Now, she was talking about Lebanon in Asia Minor. I couldn't believe that. I mean, I'm absolutely furious. FEMA's not out of money. We put in the continuing resolution $20 billion. So apparently they don't do their homework and they don't do their jobs and they don't read bills. But we need to put our American people first. The response has been an epic disaster. And if this was a Republican administration, it would be leading all news programs. It would be in all newspapers above the fold. But because it's Biden-Harris, they get a pass. And again, she's more concerned about Michigan than she is about the devastation in Georgia, in the Carolinas, Virginia, Tennessee, and Florida.
I understand, but is anybody overseeing how the money in FEMA is being spent? I mean, KJP laid it out in 2022 that they were going to use emergency money from FEMA for the illegal migrants. So can they just do that without any oversight?
Well, of course, they've done, from what I've seen, hundreds of millions of dollars have been redirected over the last few years to foreign nationals before Americans. It's FEMA. It's emergency money for Americans. They never should have done it. Unfortunately, we're out of session right now, but when we get back, we're going to have to do our job in oversight and to give the American people hard answers on this. But yeah, that's the executive branch of government. They do have leeway in doing so.
What a shame. And these people are losing everything, homes, everything, death and destruction in the Southeast. Congressman, thank you. We'll be watching your work.
You know, just as an aside as to how this keeps happening, that guy's guilty like all the rest of them, unless he voted against the continuing resolutions. Unless he was one who stood up and fearlessly said, we need to shut the government down and take as long as we need to have an actual budget. All this money is in there, and it's left to be spent at the discretion of the administrative state. Did you catch the little blurb there about how it was talking about how FEMA has authority to dispense the money to the agencies as they see fit? Now, where's that money going? Sanctuary cities. They're lining the pockets of the sanctuary cities so that they can subsidize all these illegal immigrants being in the city. And they're giving them, access to food and driver's license and Social Security support, medical insurance, things a lot of normal Americans are struggling with obtaining for themselves right now. But no, we're not the ones who matter to them, because they're about accruing more and more political influence and keeping the game going as long as they can and remaining in power as long as they can. I mean, what's the thing that comes up every time we're supposed to have a budget? There's a small contingent of Republicans, the country class, who's willing to take it to the mat and shut the government down. But then you have a bunch of other willy-nilly Republicans saying, oh, we're going to be blamed for it. We're going to be blamed for it. And they don't want to give up their potential status in the ruling class, so they go along with it. And so the merry-go-round goes around and around and around we go. And even during Trump's first term, the budget came up. And he went along with the continuing resolution. And he warned the Republicans sharply, don't put me in this position again. And one can't help but wonder if they aren't waiting for Trump to show up so that he can take the hard stand and the fall for all the rest of them. And they can stand behind him against the big bully of the ruling class. Church family, it's no time to be gutless and standing up for what we believe. Now, maybe you don't feel comfortable weighing in on the debate in social media or whatever, every step you take in faith requires a new level of faith, a new level of courage. And you're going to give up the affirmation of those who see themselves a part of the ruling class. Remember, some of these people have just been propagandized till the cows come home. And they don't even know why they believe what they believe. They just hear it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. Since the 30s, for Pete's sakes. It's almost a 100-year process. So it's been pretty tough. So remember what we said about the ruling class. They're more interested in their global influence than they are in taking care of the United States citizens. It's almost beyond comprehension that Kamala Harris could be so tone deaf as during the week of 2 hurricanes to tell the people in Appalachia that they're going to get, what was it, 700 or... And yet we're sending $152 million to Lebanon. Or the whole amount that's been going toward the support of these sanctuary cities. So they see the role of the citizen, of the country class, to work and to pay their taxes and to shut their mouths and to go fight in wars, supporting the aspirations of the ruling class. And there are people now who are rising up and saying, you know what, the jig is up. We're not going along with this anymore. We want a restoration of the Constitution. In the midst of all these considerations, some research has come out regarding Christian voting. I just want to read 2 articles to you, and this is in closing. Praise and worship, you can come on up here. The title of this article is Over 30 Million Christians May Skip the 2024 Election. A study from Arizona Christian University's Cultural Research Center reveals that around 32 million self-identified Christians who attend church may abstain from voting in the 2024 U.S. presidential election. Factors like dissatisfaction with both major party candidates and a general disinterest in politics contribute to this potential non-participation. The research also highlights a significant decline in voter enthusiasm since 2020. The research asked people who indicated they were not likely to vote to explain the reasons for that choice, said the researchers. The most common reason offered by 2/3 of the non-voters, 68%, was a lack of interest in politics and elections. Let me ask you, are you interested in how well your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will do in the future of America? Then you better get interested in politics, because that is going to determine an awful lot about what America is like in future generations. And to stay at home and watch TV and say, well, I'm really not into politics. What a childish, irresponsible, faithless view. What a total lack of responsibility and stewardship. More than half of those surveyed, 57%, expressed dissatisfaction with both primary contenders, Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. Well, I understand, but that's what we got. That's what we got. We got to make a choice as to which will advance the football further along biblical values and which will go the wrong direction. And I think we have plenty of evidence to work with. George Barna, evangelical pollster, is urging pastors and ministry leaders to leverage their influence to encourage church members to fulfill their civic responsibility by voting on November 5th. I urge you to fulfill your civic responsibility by voting on November 5th. Or before, yes. Don't forget that. Pastors often seek opportunities to have a positive influence in people's lives and upon the culture and to help the community in which their church is located, he said. This research underscores the fact that simply encouraging people to vote in order to fulfill their biblical responsibility would not only be seen as doing their job while helping the community, but an estimated 5 million regular churchgoers would be likely to vote as a result of that simple exhortation. The last election, Wisconsin was lost by 20,000. We could have another 5 million nationwide churchgoers voting. It's a massive impact. Now, some people are still going to have this attitude, well, I'm not really into this stuff. Why should I care? You should care because of what is going on in the lives of Christians right now in North Korea and China. A recent report highlights increasing cooperation between China and North Korea in targeting Christian communities. Both nations are known for harsh restrictions on religious freedoms. And they have been sharing intelligence and methods to crack down on Christian activities, including arresting and detaining believers. You think it can't happen here? We're within an election of it happening here. Investigations have revealed that those forcibly returned from China to North Korea detention centers face severe abuses, including torture, sexual violence, forced labor, and even murder under the regime of Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un. How are you going to feel if at some point one of your children or grandchildren is forced into such abuse, even torture? Will you solace yourself that, well, I really didn't feel like voting. I decided to sit this one out. Upon returning back into North Korea, one of the first questions they will be asked by authorities is whether they have met with a missionary during their time in China, said Hannah Song, executive director for North Korean human rights. This question is not merely a formality. The answer determines the severity of punishment they will endure. If an individual admits to or is found to have had contact with a missionary, particularly one affiliated with Christianity, they're often subject to the harshest forms of torture and imprisonment. Despite extreme risks, including life-threatening conditions, intense surveillance, severe penalties, churches in North Korea have continued to grow, supported by outside missionaries and churches. They will not be stopped because of the power of God flowing through them in the face of the most extreme adversities and persecutions. Yes, as people have often said, what fertilizes the growth of the church is the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs. I hope you see the clash of classes that we find ourselves in. And I would think that most of us here today would identify with the country class. But it has to go beyond that to actively fighting for our country in the voting booth and in the public arena of debate. We may be part of the country class, but if we aren't faithful to be good stewards in fighting for our country, we will be found out to be nothing more than ignorant, passive country bumpkins selling out the next generation for our seat at the table of the ruling class. That wicked generation of self-absorbed, self-important, and self-deceived elites who insist on their right to rule over us. Won't you stand?